So let me just repeat that for the virtual audience. So our next speaker is Eva Bentcheva, and Eva Bentcheva is an art historian and curator with a focus on transnational archives, conceptualism, performance, and participation in Southeast Asia and Europe. She's currently an associate lecturer at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies at Heidelberg University. And there she is developing a research project on Fluxus resonances in Southeast Asia. She's also a postdoctoral researcher and publications coordinator for a research project called Worlding Public Cultures, the Arts and Social Innovation. So we are looking forward to hearing your talk. Thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for Eva Bentcheva.
So thank you for the invitation again to present. I'm going to be speaking today about findings that are part of a bigger research project that I've been developing over the last 5 years that deal with Fluxus resonances in Southeast Asia. And I use the word resonances here quite intentionally in opposition to words like exchange or influence or spread. I take up the idea of the resonance from Reiko Tomii, who in her 2016 seminal publication, Into the Wilderness, International Contemporaneity and 1960s Art in Japan, talks about resonance as being a mode of transfer. It's a mode of transfer that is not dependent on interpersonal contacts between artists or concrete exchanges. Rather, resonance suggests that ideas and artistic practices circulate in a transnational sphere. Artists come into contact with these ideas not through one single way, but through multiple avenues. These can include the word of mouth, texts, documentation, gifts, anecdotes, gossip, and so on. The idea of resonance, I think, is particularly important for Fluxus, whose basic principles are about exchange, multiple authorship, playfulness, and collaboration. Unlike the personal exchanges and conversations which were happening perhaps across the Iron Curtain between Eastern and Western Europe, or also with artists working in Latin America, when we look to the Fluxus histories in Southeast Asia, they have a much more nebulous history there. The influences there include contact with publications, visual documentation, interactions with artists from East Asia, in particular Japan, as well as regional exhibitions and festivals, hearsay, homage, and so on. So today I'm going to speak about two artists in particular that are connected to the Philippines. You see them here. These are Judy Freya Sibayan and David Cortez Medalla. They embody two very different entries into the practices of Fluxus. During the 1970s, Sibayan was an undergraduate student at the University of the Philippines in Manila, where she encountered Fluxus works not directly through seeing the works or the artists who made them, but rather through her peers, her teachers, and documentation. Medalla, on the other hand, was based in Europe during the 1960s and the 1970s. He was living there as an expatriate artist, living a mobile lifestyle within the experimental artistic circles in Europe, the USA, and Asia. It's important to note at this point that neither Sibayan nor Medalla have been explicitly recognized as part of the core Fluxus network that we all know. Yet, playfulness, the idea of the transitional object, multiple iterations or the making of copies, which Natalie Harin has referred to as the allographic principle of Fluxus, as well as the collective production of art, are always present in their works. So today, through their practices and specific examples, what I would actually like to talk about is the idea of resonance and translation of Fluxus in their works. So why the Philippines? Of all places to start, for those of you who are not familiar with its history, the Philippines has among the longest standing history of cultural institutions and artistic education within Southeast Asia, with art academies also dating back to the mid-19th century, during which time the Philippines was a Spanish colony. After the Second World War, the dictatorial government of President Ferdinand Marcos, accompanied also by his wife Imelda, began a series of cultural politics programs. These were aimed to present the Philippines as modern and progressive within the region. And part of this involved the building of very grand cultural spaces. And what you see here on the screen, for example, is the most famous of these. That's the Cultural Center of the Philippines. Looking specifically to the former colonizer, the USA, the Marcos government supported special support for works of abstract, minimalist, and conceptually inspired projects. And I encourage you here to have a look at this image and just keep it in mind for later because I'll be discussing it. Here you have an example of these kind of rather large-scale abstract sculptures made of ready-made materials, many of them available in the Philippines in the post-war years, having this kind of rough-edged, ready-made industrial look. And I'll come back to this idea again a little bit later. But through such works, the Marcos government was specifically trying to encourage the idea of universal abstraction and modernization, but without allowing any space for explicit political critique. Now, where Fluxus comes into this in the Philippines is that the works by artists dealing with Fluxus principles actually don't emerge in opposition to such exhibitions. Rather, they emerge in conversation with precisely such state institutions, art education institutions, and independent art practices. And what we see here on the photo is Judy Freya Sibayan in the mid-1970s. Sibayan, in a conversation with me, once said that she only actually learned about Fluxus in 1983. By this point, she was doing an MFA class at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, and they did an excursion to the Baxter Art Gallery. Nevertheless, during the 1970s, her work also showed a strong interest in instructions, working with ready-made objects, shared authorship and exchanges, something that the artist describes as having, and I quote here, a performative decentering modality of art making. And the photograph that you see here is one of Judy's earlier, what she called classroom performances that she produced while she was an undergraduate student at the University of the Philippines from 1972 until 1976. During this period, the Fine Arts program at the University of the Philippines had quite a conventional focus, teaching figurative painting and sculpture, among other things. But Judy had the fortune of being part of the class of the artist Roberto Chabet. And if you remember the photograph that I showed of the installation view inside the Cultural Center of the Philippines, the work which was to the right-hand side, that is a work by Chabet. Chabet was a well-known artist in the Philippines by this point. He experimented extensively with ready-made objects, mail art, and collage. And more importantly, in his class, he provided his students with magazines. These magazines included Art Forum, Art in America, and Art International, which is just a selection of the magazines which Sibayan recalls encountering. These magazines were not meant to be read in depth. Students were encouraged only fleetingly to engage with their contents. They were not encouraged to delve into art theories and critical writings, but rather these were meant to be perused for their images, documentation, and impressions of current trends and practices. In fact, actually, when asked in an interview in 1973 by an art critic whether he thought that the Filipino art world was very influenced by the New York art scene, Chabet replied, indirectly, yes, I quote him. These influences are mainly fringe benefits from Madison Avenue, advertising layouts, and television commercials. I mean, I don't think many Filipino artists read magazines like Art Forum. Our influences are mere feedbacks and rather disorganized too. End of quote. I think this idea of the feedback is very important to pick up on here because there's a connection here to what Tomei calls the resonance also of artistic practices across space and time. And one example that I found of one such incidental feedback or resonance may be found actually in the archive of Sibayan. In 1978, Sibayan was gifted the book by Yoko Ono, Grapefruit, a book of instructions and drawings. She was gifted this by Raimundo Albano, who was at the time the director of the Cultural Center of the Philippines Art Gallery and also a personal friend and collaborator of Sibayan. At the time, Albano had been building up a library of texts and magazines for the library of the Cultural Center. Through his own artistic practice, he also had contacts to artists working in East Asia, in particular Japan. And there was a certain transfer of documentation happening here of literature, not only from Europe and North America, but also from Japan to Manila. In 1979, Sibayan and Albano collaborated to make a joint performance together with the artist Huge Bartolome, which channeled the instructional nature of grapefruit. This was a happening-like performance. The artists read a script and gifted the audience with sounds which they made by banging different objects together or rustling them together. Importantly for the Philippine context, it's necessary to say that this work was not staged in an alternative space. This was actually produced within the Cultural Center of the Philippines. Unlike in other places where the early iterations of Fluxus sometimes existed in opposition to institutions, we see their resonance here from an early stage within the institutions in the Philippines. Sibayan has argued that she intended these works from the very beginning to be a mode of parody. And given that explicit political critique was also heavily monitored and censored at the time, through putting this performance through its implicit Fluxus histories within the Cultural Center, the performance almost asked who had the power to define art here. Was it the government? Was it the institution? Was it the artists who in some cases worked in both roles, both as managers of these cultural institutions and as independently practicing artists? So we see a number of lines kind of being blurred here. And it's these ideas that Sibayan actually took up much more explicitly during the 1990s, during which time she adopted many Fluxus forms in order to develop institutional critique through parodical works of art. And we see one of her more famous projects here, that's the scapular gallery Nomad. It was first conceived in 1994 and later developed into a peripatetic art gallery. It was designed as a piece of clothing or a devotional space. So you have the scapular, which is traditionally worn in the Catholic Church. Here it is a portable art object, which the artist wore daily between 1997 and 2002. This is a parodic inversion of the art gallery or the white cube space. Sibayan instead embodied the role of a mobile, person-bound gallery or a one-woman institution. She took on all the roles of running a gallery. She invited other artists to exhibit artworks small enough to fit into the front pouch of the scapular. For me, a work like this has a very strong connection also to the idea of the flux kit or the flux box, in which there is portable objects which are not confined to the space of institutions or cultural politics, and instead offer a kind of archive of exchange. For Sibayan also, this allowed it to be easily transported and shown within other spaces. And here is, for example, a showing of the work in this kind of archival portable format at the Gwangju Biennale in 2002. Now, in contrast to Sibayan's resonance of Fluxus within her practice through this playful parody of what is the institution, I would now like to turn my attention to the artist David Medalla, whose approach to Fluxus, I would say, is rather one of translation. I use the word translation here, as it has been used by Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo, to describe not only the translation of language, as a one-to-one mapping of words, but rather as a willingness to question and relinquish one's own epistemologies in order to understand the perspective of the other. And I think that this is a lot of what David's practice is about. Medalla moved from Manila to Europe in 1960, first living in Paris and later moving to London. It was in London that he became a core figure for the kinetic art scene. His best-known works from the period include auto-creative machines such as the bubble machine, also known as Cloud Canyons, the sand machine. There is also a sketch for a mud machine, which I don't think was ever realized. And I recently discovered also the dream machine, which is a ready-made object as well. Many of these incorporated ready-made materials and movement into them. And through this work, Medalla also became the co-founder of the influential gallery Signals and its accompanying publication, the Signals News Bulletin, for which he was the chief editor. The Signals News Bulletin, in particular, became a platform for cross-pollinating practices and ideas from different contemporary art groups and movements. So it served as a kind of it served a networking function at the time and allowed Medalla to build up connections to many artists also from mainland Europe and the US working within Fluxus. Simultaneously also, he participated in exhibitions such as Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, curated in 1969 by Harald Seemann at the Kunsthalle Bern, and later also partook in Seemann's iteration of Documenta 5 in 1972. So it's through this combination of editing signals, and the different exhibitions that Medalla was part of, that he came to be recognized as a tangential figure within the broader global history of Fluxus at the time. Despite these personal connections, however, Medalla never officially situated himself as part of the core Fluxus networks. Nevertheless, in 1992, he was invited to contribute as one of only 2 Southeast Asian artists to the exhibition Flux Attitudes at the New Museum in New York. This inclusion was partially based on his crossing paths with Fluxus-associated figures such as Nam June Paik and Joseph Beuys, but also for his role as a contact point for Latin American and Asian artists working in Paris and London. In a subversive act, Medalla decided to paint a figurative mural on the wall inside the exhibition space. Critics have interpreted this gesture as a rejection of Fluxus histories, but I also read this as a gesture of Medalla's affirmation of Fluxus's rebellious and playful attitude, as well as his refusal to be pinned down to one specific medium. In other works, however, the allusions to Fluxus are much more explicit. Here we see Medalla's affinity for exchanging tactile and found objects, impromptu performances in everyday spaces, international correspondence in the form of letters, instructions, and poetry. One of his most iconic works, which I show you here, is A Stitch in Time, which the artist first conceived in 1968. The work embodies what Nathalie Harin calls the allographic. It is dependent upon the making of multiple copies in which each copy is essentially an original. The work proposes a simple instruction: to stitch small, portable objects and messages onto a suspended sheet of cloth. The myth around the work is that of an exchange of love tokens. Medalla has said that in 1967, he parted ways with 2 of his lovers, and without having a gift to give them for farewell, he handed them a handkerchief of his which had his initials embroidered onto them. Years later, when he was at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, he saw a tattered cloth hanging off the backpack of a backpacker, and he recognized on the cloth his own initials stitched amidst many other objects which others had placed upon it. So the work kind of grew out of this romantic idea of the small portable object traveling and moving across space. And Medalla transformed that into a living archive of cherished and symbolic objects belonging to others. For me, this work, even though it's much larger, but it also has an echo of the Flux box. Yet this time, this is translated into a soft, malleable form, which can be moved, it can be folded, it can be gifted much more easily. It is also a translation not only of the many individual experiences of the people stitching it, but it is also a translation of a specific space and time in which the work is reactivated. So I show you here 2 photos, one of its early activation in London in the 1970s at the height of leftist movements, and then we see another iteration of it here at the Venice Biennial in 2017, where it is completely loaded with mainly with people's business cards, which were stitched onto it. Sonia Boyce and Dorothy Price have recently described this work as having, and I quote here, an ongoing, open-ended, and unplanned futurity. Elsewhere, Guy Brett has referred to it as the work could travel across time. Its specific form I see, however, also as a translation of Fluxus principles to think about the Philippines during the 1970s. Between 1969 and 1970, Medalla undertook a journey across Africa and Asia, ending up in the Philippines, where he witnessed the early stage of transition of power by the Marcos government towards martial law. He also encountered contemporary art, which was being shown at the time at institutions such as the Cultural Center of the Philippines. And this is where I come back to that early photo that I showed you of that exhibition shot, where we saw these large-scale installations made of heavy industrial material, found materials as well. And for Medela, this kind of abstract installation-based practice became representative not only of the onset of martial law in the Philippines, but also of a lack of fluidity and a lack of multiple voices in the art scene at the time. Returning to Europe later that year, he therefore gave A Stitch in Time a much more explicitly political framing. And here I show you one photograph in 1972 of how the work was exhibited at Documenta 5, where it was part of a bigger building called the People's Participation Pavilion. And on several other occasions, he also showed the work in this format, where he also included alongside it, for example, posters that he had made by hand with political agitation against the dictatorial developments in the Philippines at the time. So this practice of sitting together and actually stitching things into one collective, multiply authored object also became a reference to a lot of the socialist principles at the time and the working class fights against oppression. The found materials now took on new lives as transitional objects, transitional being here both transfer across space and time, but also objects that are dear to the people and given to somebody else as a gift. These became here also gestures of care, empathy, and solidarity with the causes of oppressed peoples in the face of capitalist and dictatorial expansion during the 1970s and onwards. And so I would like to end on this point and say I presented two different entry points into Fluxus connected to the Philippines, one being the resonances through which Sibayan learned about them, and the other one being through this active translation from Medela's much more direct contacts to the Fluxus art world. But I'll end there, and maybe we can pick that up in the discussion. Thank you.